So I'd like us at the beginning here to imagine you're driving a car, and this is a pretty extreme picture. This is what ChatGPT gave me to show a picture of a car on a ditch. Um, but it's pretty extreme. But oftentimes it's not that extreme. But sometimes it is a little dangerous. You're driving this car, and it's up on a level and there's a ditch on both sides, right? So you're driving a car and you're aware that if you turn and go into the ditch, you're going to get in trouble. If you turn and go the other way into the other ditch, you're going to be in trouble. The one most serious car accident I ever had was when I was young. I fell asleep driving late at night, and I woke up as the car had crossed the road and went into the ditch, and I woke up just as I hit an approach. And I did the old Dukes of Hazzard jump in my car without meaning to. Fortunately, I had my seatbelt on, and this was before the airbags. So basically, the airbag was my head hitting the steering wheel, which might explain some things about my temperament and my mental abilities, but I was okay. And, stay out of the ditch, right? And the point that I want to bring here today is that there's two ways you can fall into the ditch. And to drive, you want to stay centered, okay? So with that in mind, that mindset, that concept is so central to living well. I mean, go back to the ancient Greeks. Aristotle talked about virtue is oftentimes a balance between extremes. We called it the golden mean. So like if you're going to be industrious, on the one hand, that is avoiding the ditch of laziness, let's say, and then on the other hand, the other extreme would be, being compulsive and crazy about how you live. So in the middle of that is the golden mean is industriousness. Or I don't know, let's say love, where on the one hand you have apathy and hatred, on the other hand you have this neediness, right? In the middle of that, the golden mean is the actual virtue of love. So that's always about this balance. Physical health is often about a balance, that our system is in balance. If we go to various extremes, we get unbalanced. We are built to exercise, right? Our bodies are built for movement. If we have no movement, if we do very little activity, there's going to be unhealth. But if we overexert ourselves, if we're working out and running and being crazy that way, there's going to be unhealth. It's all about this balance between the extremes. Same thing is true when it comes to Christian truth. The Bible, one of the reasons that it can be difficult and confusing for people is there's teaching from a variety of perspectives, and then a pastor or some person gets up and says, the Bible says this, and you think to yourself, that sounds a little crazy to me. I'm not sure. And there's maybe a verse to support it, but other teaching in the Bible seems to have a different bent towards it, right? And so over the years, Christian theologians have often taught that the focus, what we really need to understand, is to keep these various truths in balance. On the one hand, let's say with our perspective about who we are as human beings, we are made in the image of God. We're great. We're awesome people, and we are sinful, fallen. We have all these negative tendencies. So somewhere between those two is a healthy perspective about what the Bible teaches about human beings. The Bible teaches about God being a God of love. And what does that mean? So is it toleration on the one hand? Is it on the other hand, the extreme, like being angry? Somewhere in the middle of that is our understanding of theological truth. And so what we understand or interpret to be or refer to as theological error is often a truth in the Bible, but taken to the extreme. And so the health then, the reality is to have this middle, being in the sort of the center. All right. The middle way or balance between extremes. And that's how it is with our emotional life. So we're talking in this message series about a life of renewal, a life of spiritual renewal. We go through life and we have challenges, we have frustrations, we have difficulties that eat away at our soul, eat away at our well-being, pull us out of relationships, and we need God's strength, we need God's healing, we need God's power to live well in the midst of all of this. And so in this series, we're talking about 12 keys, 12 ways in which that healing, that restoration, that empowerment comes. Today we're talking about emotional awareness. Emotional awareness as a key for living well, as a key if you're in addiction to overcoming that addiction, a key for if you're in unhealthy relationships, how to manage, how to navigate life in those unhealthy relationships, a key for how to live well when it comes to your work and how to be a healthy, godly, Christ-like presence in that place. It's emotional awareness. So what does that mean? We're going to talk about that in just a little bit. But the problem or the challenge is with emotional awareness is it's like being on a road and there's a ditch we can fall into on one side or the other. So here's how we state it. If in your worship handout there's an outline, and in the outline there's somewhere, I think at the top, there's the actual statement. This is our commitment as growing Christians. We have a commitment to emotional awareness. That is to understand and deal with our emotions and internal needs. Being a Christian, living the Christian life, is not simply about believing the right things. It's about engaging in a relationship with our Creator and living out a life that the Holy Spirit is filling us and empowering us to live. And for that to happen, we are emotional beings, and for that to happen then, that's going to affect our emotional life. We don't live at the mercy of our emotions, but neither do we ignore or try to suppress them. So here it is. In our emotional life, our struggle is, our challenge is, to avoid the opposite dangers. So here they are. This is how Christians can fall into the ditch, the two ditches that we could fall into. And the first one, the near side ditch, is not understanding, acknowledging, or dealing with our emotions. Not understanding, acknowledging, or dealing with our emotions. Ecclesiastes talks about, and many passages will do this, but Ecclesiastes talks about the reality is to live life as God intends us to live. There are going to be times when we must weep. There are going to be times when we must laugh. There are going to be times when we mourn. There are going to be times that we dance. And that's why we're thankful not to be Southern Baptists, because we can actually dance. Anyway, sorry, that was a bad joke. It was not mean-spirited, but it was a bad joke. So a couple aspects about what it means to live in this way, and the challenge that we get into, the problem of suppressing, denying our emotional life. Being created in the image of God. For you and me, we are image bearers of God, and part of what that means is that we feel as well as think. Now, this can be confusing and challenging for us to think about this. God is not just a infinite, powerful AI, right? Just intelligence. God is person. God is not just a force. God is a person. And part of personhood, part of being a person, is to not just know and relate on an intellectual level like an AI, but to feel. And therefore to feel, to have connection. So in the Bible, we find scriptures that reveal God functioning with emotion. And again, this can be confusing, and it can also be scary for us to think about that, because if we think about, let's say, God being jealous or angry, we might think of human beings that we know who are jealous and angry, and they're dysfunctional. And so if you have this crazy dysfunctional person who's jealous and angry and they have infinite power, watch out, because that's a crazy, terrible situation. But God is the perfection blend of all of these attributes. But part of these attributes of God, which again in the Old Testament, these people they're trying to figure out, how do we relate to this being who, there are times when God is sad, there are times when God is angry, there are times when God is jealous, but also times when God is happy, and most important for us to realize that God is not just intelligence, but being, but person, is that God loves. God has emotional connection to his creatures. Now, what that means for us is that if we're going to live as Christians, then we are going to be fully human, means to be fully alive in our emotional nature. The Psalms are great examples of this. There are Psalms that talk about being joyful and happy, but there's also a lot of Psalms of lament. There's a lot going on emotionally in a lot of the Psalms. In fact, theologians tell us that around almost half of the Psalms are Psalms that we would call Psalms of lament, where people are expressing sadness and confusion and even anger towards God about how life is. And people are being very emotional in how they are talking to God, how they're expressing themselves, how they're reflecting about life. And so it's like the full orbed all the dimensions of our human emotions come out. And people are not shamed about that. That is not seen as a bad thing. It's just reality that we as human beings have these emotions. It's actually a good thing. Lamentations, the whole book about this theme, one of the verses, 3:20, says, "I will never forget this awful time as I grieve over my loss." And a lot of us have time, well, all of us, let's say, all of us have times where there's a lot of great things happening and we're happy and we're joyful, but we also have terrible loss. And then we grieve. And then other people tell us we shouldn't grieve because of this, that, or the other thing. And those people need to shut up, because we grieve. It's part of being human. And we all grieve differently, and we grieve in different ways, and that's, again, part of our human being, part of our being human. And if you ever had as a kid, you had to learn to memorize certain Bible verses, the favorite Bible verse for every kid to have to memorize is John 11:35, the shortest verse in the Bible, but it's poignant that Jesus cried, Jesus wept, and he wept at the grave of Lazarus, his friend. So even Jesus, we realize that Jesus came and reveals God's being to us, reveals God's nature to us, and Jesus had that full dimension of emotional life. Okay, so to be fully human, to be fully developed as Christian people, we are emotional beings. Problem, what a lot of us do instead is we go through our life, and instead of understanding and acknowledging and dealing with our emotions, we try to ignore them, deny them, and suppress them. I shouldn't feel that. Or someone else is emotional, you try to shut it down because I don't want to go there. And we try to just pretend that we don't have these feelings, we don't have these emotions. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you a video now. And this is actually a video from Gabor Mate. He is a Hungarian medical doctor. I think he's practicing in Canada. And he writes a lot about how our emotions and emotional life relates to illness later in life, and then also addiction later in life. And so this is 4 minutes Um, so go ahead and show the video. He talks about the roots. Go ahead.
Child is born, the child has two needs. The first need is for attachment. And attachment is contact, connection, love. Without that, the human child does not survive. Even an avian child doesn't survive. The baby bird has to have an attachment with the parents. The parents have to be attached to the baby. Otherwise, the infant simply does not survive. Mammalians even more so, and most so the human, because we're the least developed, the least mature, with the least developed brains, and the most dependent for the longest period of time of any creature. So our attachment needs are enormous, and they remain important throughout lifetime because we have to have attachments to form societies, social groups, without which we don't survive. So attachment is a huge need. We have to connect, belong, be loved by, and love. That's just a basic human need. But we have another need as well, which is for authenticity. The authenticity is the capacity to know what we feel, to be in touch with our bodies, and to be able to express who we are and manifest who we are in our activities and in our relationships. Now, why is that? Well, think of a human being in the evolutionary period who's not in touch with their body and their gut feelings. How long do they survive out there in the wild? So authenticity is another huge survival need. But what happens to a child where the attachment need is not compatible with the need for authenticity? In other words, if I'm authentic, my parents will reject me. If I feel what I feel and express what I feel and insist on my own truth, my parents can't handle it. And parents convey those messages unconsciously all the time. Not because they mean to, not because they don't love the child, but because they themselves are suppressed, or traumatized, or hurt, or stressed. Now, what does the child do with that? Well, if I give up my attachment for the sake of authenticity, I lose my relationships on which my life depends. Therefore, there's no question. What becomes suppressed is our authenticity, our emotions. And then we become 35, 40, and we don't know who we are. And somebody asks us, what do you feel? You say, I have no idea. And how many times we've all had the experience of having an inkling of a strong gut feeling, but we're ignoring it? We're ignoring it and we get into trouble. Well, that tells us what happened. What happened was that at some point we found out that it was too costly for our attachment relationships to be in touch with our gut feelings. So then it becomes not our first nature, but our second nature, to lose touch with ourselves and to suppress our gut feelings. And then we pay the cost later on in the form of addiction, mental illness, or any range of physical illnesses. But it all began with this tragic conflict that children should never be confronted with, but are all the time, between authenticity on the one hand and attachment on the other.
Hear that? Could you hear the? Okay. He has a little bit of an accent and sometimes hard to understand, but attachment and authenticity, and it's the result, the fall into sin, this broken world that we live in, that some of us grow up with this sense that we can't be who we really are. We can't, that to feel what we think we feel, we have to sort of deny that. And then that's what helps us sort of get along in life, but it's a problem because we're not dealing with the emotions that are really there. So that's one of the ways it happens. It comes from this brokenness and the messages that we sort of figure out that we have to, like, I shouldn't feel that, I shouldn't think that, I need to just sort of suppress that. I work with a lot of men in the coaching that I do and counseling and stuff. And this also comes up as kind of a unique male thing. And again, I realize we all have different ways of being women, all different ways of being men. But there's a kind of a manliness or a mindset about what being manly is, which relates to not being connected to your emotional life, not being in touch with your feelings, because that's not manly. So this book is a great book. Steve Magnus, he is a coach. He's a writer, and he works with professional athletes and also people in the business world. And so he wrote this book called "Do Hard Things," and he has some words to say about the masculine mindset of suppressing emotions. And so basically his point is that we have our ideas about being tough are really way wrong. All right? So here's what he says. We have a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to be tough. We hold on to ideas that better resemble a middle school football coach, their ideal of toughness, rather than reality. It's time to move to a definition based on navigating discomfort by creating space to take thoughtful action. Toughness is about responding, not reacting. For far too long, we've propped up an external version of toughness based on bluster and machismo, while neglecting inner strength based on humility and equanimity. In other words, being calm and peaceful and then being able to respond. That's equanimity. He says real toughness is quiet and comes deep from within. It's about making the right choice under stress, uncertainty, and fatigue. This requires emotional control. If you're like me, grew up in sports, you learned that feelings are enemies. Don't show emotion. Ignore what you feel. We send that same message to the workplace, parenting, and beyond. Feelings and emotions are messages from our bodies that relay what's going on. Don't shun them, decipher their language instead. Look, don't shun them. Laugh with those who laugh. Weep with those who weep. Mourn with those who mourn. It's part of who we are. In psychology, he says the ability to add nuance to emotional experience is called interoception. Experts in interoception don't push away sensations, they learn to understand them. Only once we speak their language can we then know how to deal with them. To accept those emotions, to deal with those emotions. That's what we need to do. Because if we don't, what happens if we don't? We have the feelings don't go away. The emotions don't go away. They remain in our system. They circulate in our system, and they create dis-ease, or manifest themselves as physical diseases, and then buffering strategies, where we do things to not have to feel, like watch endless TV or eat junk or get into whatever other kinds of addiction that we get into so that we don't have to deal with these emotions that we don't want to deal with. Okay, so we need to understand and deal with our emotions for that reason. We also need to build emotional awareness because that's required for love. So Romans 12, he says, rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn. If you are emotionally clueless, that's going to be hard to do. Ephesians 4 verse 2 says, be completely humble and gentle, and be patient, bearing with one another in love. And so, again, as I work with men, this is a thing that we talk about a lot, is that we need to cultivate a deeper understanding and appreciation of what's happening in our emotional life and other people's emotional life, because that's what enables us to relate then in love. Emotional cluelessness derails derails our success in relationships, and derails our success in our career, derails our ability to relate. It derails our ability to be the loving presence that God calls us to be. All right, so that's one side of the ditch that we can fall into. But there's another side. We could veer across traffic in even a more dangerous way and fall into the other ditch. The other side here is to let our emotions control us. So, on the one hand, there's the danger that some of us are falling into, which is to suppress our emotions. But the other danger is to let our emotions control us. So, the Bible is filled with teaching. We could spend the whole morning talking or going over passages that challenge us, that focus on the need to take certain actions no matter what we feel. So Ephesians 4 says, "In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you're angry. Do not give the devil a foothold." Just because you feel something does not give you the right to do X, Y, or Z, to say X, Y, or Z. You are, I am, we as Christians are called to live with self-control, and therefore self-control over our emotional life, rather than letting our emotions control us. Proverbs 25, this is kind of the theme verse of this whole message series, which is about self-control, the practice of, or the habit of, the ability to exert control over ourselves. A person who does not have that is like a city broken into and left without walls. Galatians 5 gives us the list of the fruits of the Spirit. And as you look at this list, just notice the emotional awareness part of a number of these fruits of the Spirit. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Without these fruits of the Spirit, it's hard to maintain good marriages, to have good families, to function well in relationships with people in our work, in our neighborhood. This is what God brings into our lives and enables us to be witnesses for Him. James 1 says, "Brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires." So you have your emotions, fine, but don't let those emotions control you. So this Greg Kretsch, I think is his last name. He's written a few books. He's a Western psychologist who's interested in a particular kind of psychology, or a psychological approach from Japan called Morita therapy, which it's fascinating because in some ways this Japanese philosophy or Japanese approach to psychology is more consistent with Christian teaching than Western psychology in a lot of ways. And one of those is what it teaches about your emotional life. If you go to a Morita therapy person, a Japanese therapist, and you start talking about how you feel, what you're feeling that day, that therapist is going to go, "Well, that's interesting, but what are you going to do about it?" So you can have your feelings, but okay, what's the next action? And maybe you feel afraid. Okay, that's fine. You probably should feel afraid, but what are you going to do about it? You feel sad. Okay, but there's reasons why you feel sad. Okay, what are you going to do about it? So here's what Kretsch says. Feelings are sensations. The ability to tolerate sensations we'd rather not have is supremely important. Without such tolerance, our lives remain needlessly vulnerable to our wild and fickle feelings, and our plans get needlessly derailed. Without such tolerance, we can become preoccupied to an unhealthy degree with our private internal experience, and thereby become distracted from the world around us, the needs of others, and the tasks at hand. It is difficult to have a great life, and I'll make it, it's difficult to have a godly life without coexisting with emotions or with the feelings that come up in the process of creating that great life. Notice the feeling, recognize it for what it is, take a deep breath, and shift your energies to doing that which needs doing. In fact, I'll add something in there. Notice the feeling, recognize it for what it is, take a deep breath, and say a prayer. Turn it over to God, and then do the next right thing. So, two ditches we can fall into. Trying to go through life denying, suppressing, ignoring our emotions, and therefore those things bubbling up and leading us to do all kinds of things to try to not have to feel. That's one ditch. The other ditch is to live our lives like a ping pong ball, depending on what we feel that day, how we feel about this interaction, and we just react to that, just rather than living with self-control over our emotional life. So that's the other ditch. And that's like crossing the road, because in the process of crossing the road, you might run into somebody else. So that's not just dangerous to you, that's dangerous to everybody else too. So as we close here, I will just invite you to reflect on this. What tendency do I have? Each of us think about that. What's the issue for me? Not what's the issue of my spouse or my kid or this other person, across from me or whatever. What's my tendency? What's the way that I have a tendency or have the propensity to get derailed? And then what can I do about that?